The Oregon Trail almost needs no introduction. If you have seen the meme, "You have died of dysentery," then you've at least seen a popular screen from the Oregon Trail. The popularity for the game is not anything new though. It sold about 65 million copies, and the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, MEC, was making about $10 million a year in the 90s, according to Axios. The game was also inducted in Strong's World Video Game Hall of Fame. However, there is a bit of a sad story here, as the original creators, who we'll talk about later in this video, ended up not receiving any compensation from the game, according to the 74. Welcome to Memory Card, the history of video games, where we look at the entire history of video games through all of your favorite gaming consoles, through all of your favorite games, and through all of the obscurity and pivotal moments in gaming history. In this episode, we talk about one of the biggest early video games, the Oregon Trail. For a little bit of context on the history of the Oregon Trail, we're going to have to go all the way back to the 1800s to see what inspired such a cult classic. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Americans were eager to continue to push west, and that included Oregon country, which was a patch of wilderness that was still owned by the British at the time. Oregon country included present-day Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho. Lewis and Clark went on their famous expedition west, and it was all part of a plan to hopefully open Oregon country for American settlers, but the route they took was extremely hazardous, and a trail needed to be formed that made traveling to Oregon country easier. Enter Robert Stewart, who is a part of a group of fur traders known as the Astorians, and Stewart is known as the first white man to use what is known as the Oregon Trail. It was a 2,000-mile journey from Fort Astoria to St. Louis in 1810 and took about 10 months. The first wagons to use the trail from Missouri to Oregon was in 1836, and a missionary group led by Marcus and Narcissa Whitman had a goal to reach the Willamette Valley. Yet they didn't complete their quest, having to abandon it 200 miles off of Oregon. The next big note in the Oregon Trail's history came when a wagon train filled with 1,000 people reached Oregon in 1843 in what is known as the Great Migration. They left Independence, Missouri and used the South Pass, which is a 12-mile wide valley, to cross the Rocky Mountains and reach Oregon. With that bit of context, we jump forward to 1971 when Bill Heinemann, Don Rawitsch, and Paul Dillenberger developed the Oregon Trail. It was originally created to teach children in school about the life of a 19th century pioneer who used the Oregon Trail. It was eventually released to the market by MEC in 1974. All three were students at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and were student teachers. While roommates, Rawitsch ended up creating a board game that would help his students learn, and Heinemann made the suggestion that it, quote, would be a perfect application for a computer program, he said, according to West St. Paul Reader. The text-based game was created in 2 weeks for Rawitsch's students. The reception was astounding, and children were constantly lining up to play it. However, after a month or two, Rawitsch actually deleted the game but held on to a paper copy, which ended up being a wise move. After spending some time in a folder in Rawitsch's desk, MEC added the game to its catalog after Rawitsch retyped the code onto a portable terminal and after receiving approval from Heinemann and Dillenberger. The game garnered attention all across Minnesota until it caught the eye of a little company called Apple. The game would appear on Apple II computers, and the rest was history. "I was hired by MEC in October 1974, Rawitsch said, and we had a shared library where people could submit programs they had written, and then the staff would decide if they were worthwhile putting in the library. So over Thanksgiving weekend, I had a cold and I had nothing else to do. I decided to bring a portable terminal back to the house, and from the kitchen phone, I connected to the MEC computer and typed in line by line the code on the printout. Sadly, though, none of the three received any financial compensation, let alone recognition, for creating the game. It was not until 1994, when MEC brought the three together at the Mall of America, that they had received some kind of recognition. This was all because they gave the game to MEC without any expectation of being repaid. However, none have expressed any bitterness about not receiving compensation or recognition. However, fans of the game have helped the three continue to receive the recognition they deserve, creating a game that has captured the typing fingers of many across the world. The game's popularity has gone beyond just the game itself, with t-shirts, card games, mugs, socks, memes, and so much more in merchandise. It is insane how dedicated the fan base is for this game and how widespread the game has become in pop culture. West St. Paul reader did an interview with Heinemann on December 14th, 2020, and it was fascinating to see the conversation with someone who had created such a cultural phenomenon. Quote, "The most surprising thing about creating the Oregon Trail computer program is that after 20 years, I got no recognition, but in the last 10 years, there have been numerous documentaries, speaking engagements, and other notoriety." Well, Bill, that includes this one as well. However, there are two other individuals who were a part of that process as well, and that includes Rawitsch. Slate interviewed Rawitsch, and it is equally as fascinating to read. This includes him talking about the response of his students to the Oregon Trail. "We spent a week on Oregon Trail," Rawitsch remembers, and so students had 4 or 5 days to try it out. And they were, compared to the usual non-excitement of reading about history, extremely excited to do this and fascinated by the computer. There were times when certain groups finished their trip before the bell rang. And so kids start over for as long as they could, and once I started using this game in my classes, I got students coming in after school and lunch periods and so forth just because they wanted to try it many times over. Rawitsch also did a Reddit AMA about 8 years ago, and I'll read off a couple of questions and answers that provide an interesting look into the game and its development. The first question asked, "What is the strangest bug/error you encountered while making the game?" Rawitsch responded, "Once some kids from Alaska wrote MEC claiming to have a foolproof method for winning. They entered a negative number for food spending with the program subtracted from their money, which actually added to their money. They got rich. We quickly added an input check to all money questions to reject negative numbers." Another question asked, "Is there anything you wanted to include in the game but had to cut due to memory limitations?" Rawitsch's response, "Not due to memory, well, maybe my own, but it would have been interesting to add a Native American viewpoint, perhaps a character who watches the wagons come into that territory." Last but not least, let's look at Dillenberger, who was interviewed by NPR News on December 27, 2021. You can listen to the full conversation on NPR News' website, but for now, I'll play a short snippet of a couple of quotes I found interesting from the interview, starting with Dillenberger talking about the representation of Native Americans in the game, which seems to echo what Rawitsch said as well.
Because the game was used as a social studies simulation, the original game puts you in the shoes of settlers who were part of the process of colonialism and displacement in this country back when. Looking back, how do you feel about the way the game has approached those topics?
We were careful to have Native Americans as helpful or friendly. We were conscious of that. But it'd be interesting to have a similar game from the point of view of the Native Americans who were, like you said, displaced. It's just something that I think is important to look at both sides to things.
And here's a quick quote about Dillenberger talking about the fame and fortune from the game.
I understand that you and your co-creators didn't make any money from this at all? You weren't even recognized as creators for more than 20 years? What happened there?
Yeah, I guess we kind of donated it to MEC, the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, through Don, because he worked there. At that time, there were no software companies that were selling, software programs, at least for education. Also, MEC was a state-funded nonprofit organization at the time, and so there really was no money to be made anywhere there. Eventually, the state told MEC they had to support themselves, And so then they started selling their products to other people. But by that time, we were kind of forgotten about, I guess. They finally recognized us in 1995 or 94, I think, at a Mall of America celebration of the anniversary of the Oregon Trail, because it was their number one seller, and it took in quite a bit of money. And then since then, we've done lots of interviews, and we've been on, television and in newspaper articles and magazine articles ever since. So we've got a lot of fame, I guess, but in terms of fame and fortune, the fortune part wasn't there. It just wasn't to be. But we're okay with that.
Well, I'm glad that you've gotten your due. Do you have any clout with the kids that when they know that you created the Oregon Trail?
And I spent 30 years in Minneapolis public schools, and then another 9 in St. Louis Park, and then I was a sub. And even as a sub, just 2-3 years ago, I would tell the kids, I've got these claim to fame, and so I'd mention the Oregon Trail. How many have heard of it? And just about everybody raised their hand. Or I'd say, Google my name. And then kids would have me, ask for autographs. And these are students. And of course, their parents, they remember playing the game. They'd say things like, boy, you saved my life in middle school because that was one nice part of my day or something. It's just, there's a lot of nostalgia out there. And we feel good that we've reached so many people and had that much effect on people.
Now that we've covered the history of the Oregon Trail and its development, let's talk about the actual game, and although there's not too much to say since it's not a complicated game, we can still cover the basics. The game is extremely simple, but is also known for its extreme difficulty. The player is a wagon leader and has to guide a group of settlers from Independence, Missouri to Willamette Valley in Oregon. The goal is to safely travel the Oregon Trail in 1848. There are several different aspects of the game, including hunting, resource management, and keeping as many of your group alive as possible. There are several points where you must make hard decisions, and if you don't plan well enough, your run's going to end. There are several ways to play the game, but I opted to play it by using the free 1990 version on Visit Oregon's website, which also includes a history of the game that I've already used for this video, as well as some helpful tips. The game opens in Independence, Missouri, and you first get to pick your backstory as well as name your character, so it has some RPG elements to it, which is pretty neat for such a simple game. After picking a month to set out and buying supplies, you set off on the Oregon Trail. The interface states the date, weather, health, food supply, next landmark, and how many miles you've traveled. It also pops up with any important status updates as you watch your little pixelated wagon roll across the Oregon Trail. When stopping, you have several options to pick from, including continuing on the trail, checking supplies, looking at the map, changing your pace to go faster or slower, changing food rations, resting, trading, and hunting. Oftentimes, you are faced with a choice you have with multiple options that can result in different outcomes. One of the most famous aspects of the game is dying, and it is pretty easy to do so. Illnesses can claim your party, such as snake bites, measles, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and exhaustion. Players can also die from a broken leg or drowning. Oxen can also die along the journey. If someone in your party dies, a funeral is held and you have the chance to write an epitaph. If you are able to beat the game, there is a point system that awards players based on survivors, remaining supplies, cash, and the backstory chosen at the start of the game. For example, carpenters receive double points and farmers receive triple. And there's not too much else to the game of the Oregon Trail. And while the Oregon Trail was a huge success and has become such a huge phenomena, there is a predecessor that is worth talking about and I think deserving of its own episode. And that game is called the Sumerian game. And we will cover that in the next episode of Memory Card, the history of video games. So that'll include this episode of Memory Card, and again, I had a blast looking into the history of the Oregon Trail. I wasn't expecting such a simple game to have the backstory that it did, and that's why I wanted to do this series so much, is to learn all about this stuff. So I just learned about this game called the Sumerian Game when I was doing research on the Oregon Trail. It is a game that I also believe deserves its own episode, and it actually came out before the Oregon Trail, so this probably won't be the last time, but we will be rewinding the clock back to cover the Sumerian Game in the next episode. With that in mind, please provide feedback. I would greatly appreciate it. I am a one-man crew, and much like my mistakes of not covering the Sumerian Game sooner and the one you just heard, I'm sure mistakes are going to happen. As always, please check out all of the sources I use in this video. They deserve all the love, and without them, I wouldn't be able to make this video. Join me next week as I cover the Sumerian Game, and thanks for watching. I want to thank the sources for this video, especially a shout out to NPR News, Slate, West St. Paul Reader, Reddit, Axios, the 74 Million Organization, and the National Park Service.